Hi, everyone. Welcome to Food Talk Live. I'm Danny Nierenberg, president of Food Tank. Today's discussion is part of a 5-part live stream series around the Refresh Working Group's Food Plus Tech policy platform. You can find the platform and the previous discussions on foodtank.com. The Refresh Working Group is a multi-stakeholder platform made up of farmers, academics, entrepreneurs, chefs, advocates, technologists, and other experts who really wish to explore the complex intersection of agriculture, food, and technology. Over the last few days, we've had really interesting discussions on the need for expanding rural broadband and the need for supply chain transparency. Today, my co-host, Chloe Sorvino, who leads coverage of food and agriculture at Forbes, and I are really excited to talk to our panelists about ensuring the fair use of data in the food system. I feel like there are a lot of misconceptions and sometimes a lot of fears about how data is used and how it is collected. And we're really excited for our panelists to dispel some of these myths. Our experts include Kacey Hanson, the program manager from the Department of Population Health at the University of Texas at Austin Dell Medical School. One of my favorite people, Ali Lange, the public policy manager at Google, who's also a founding member of the Refresh Working Group. It only exists because of Ali and all of her creativity. Matthew Lang, the founder and president at IC Foods, and Robyn O'Brien, the co-founder of rePlant Capital. So welcome to you all again. Thanks, a huge thanks really to Chloe for being here the last few days. And I know Chloe has a really riveting question to begin today's discussion.
Thank you, Danny. I can't believe it's already day 3. Just to set this up for all of us, farmers can't be expected to take advantage of all the technological opportunities out there, from IoT sensors to drones to AI, without an assurance of protection. But these technologies are going to be needed to help bridge the gaps we face in feeding a world amid climate change. Common standards for fair and appropriate use of data will help everyone make the most of data-driven opportunities. So this conversation really is about access and trust. With that, I'd love to ask each panelist to kick it off by introducing themselves briefly and answering, how did you come to the world of agriculture, and what does data protection mean to you in your business or your work? Robyn, you want to kick it off?
Yeah, that sounds great, Chloe. Thank you. So how did I come to agriculture? I'm actually named after a farmer in New Zealand, so I was born into it. She's a sheep farmer in Palmerston North, and I grew up with an incredible awareness of the impact, the rewards, and the toll of farming. She lost her husband when she was 42 to a heart attack, so she ran the farm with 3 daughters. She suffered breast cancer. One of her own children was diagnosed with cancer, and so it's very personal to me, the work. I spent the last 20 plus years in food and agriculture. I was on a team that managed $20 billion in assets, and as the woman on the team, I was asked to cover the food industry. In the last 15 years or so, I've done a lot of very high-level consulting to the multinational food companies as people were waking up to what was happening to the food system. And a lot of that awakening was driven by diagnosis, whether it was cancer, pediatric cancer, autism, allergies, Alzheimer's, diabetes, obesity. We were waking up to the realization that we really didn't know how our food was produced and what was going into it. And I think that really is the heart of this conversation today. What we're talking about is transparency. And so as a co-founder of rePlant, we saw this enormous tension between a supply chain and what the 21st century consumer was asking for versus what the reality was for these multinational food companies. And so they have inherited these supply chains out of the 20th century that really don't meet the needs of the 21st century consumer. 80% of us are buying something organic, 75% of all grocery store categories carry something organic, but only 1% of the supply chain is organic. And that math just doesn't work. And if you've got these conventional financial institutions financing these companies, they've got them on that quarterly earnings model. And man, that is a song and dance routine, because I sat on the opposite side of the desk and I made those guys do it. And that quarterly earnings model doesn't afford these multinational food companies the time and the runway to convert their supply chains. So we co-founded rePlant Capital with Don Schaefer, who was CEO of RSF Social Finance, and Dave Haynes, who is with Greenmont Capital, to really provide that transition capital with the value-aligned mission of soil health. So, the common theme in all of this is transparency. And in order for every stakeholder in this system to succeed, that radical transparency is required.
Matt, Allie? Anyone? Kacey?
I'll go. I just want to kind of ground folks. I am in the city of Austin, Texas, probably one of the most sought after towns in America at this point. And we are new to Austin, the medical school that is. And one of the things that we recognize in our founding is that while Austin is a desirable city, we are very segregated. And we also have a large segment of our minority populations who are less than healthy. And so one of the things that we do in my division, I am in the Department of Population Health, and my division is community engagement and health equity. And one of the things that we are really passionate about, I want to say is the word, is really that community engagement in order to get to health equity. And what we recognize is that there are lots of social determinants that determine if someone is going to be healthy or not. And so we want to engage folks at the ground level and have conversations with them, connect them with resources in an effort to improve their health. And so that my work, that social determinants of health work, has led me to actually being a member of our Austin Travis County Food Policy Board. And we recognize that not only as a board, but also as a university, that food is the thing that everyone needs, and not everyone's getting it. And then the last thing that I'll say is, even in our city, you know, we probably have about 1 to 2 days worth of food in our local area, and that has to change. We are a very large state. We have plenty of land, and yet we have our food mostly brought in and from other places. And so we just have to do a better job of that. So I have the opportunity to sit at multiple tables and have conversations about this, and then go back to the people and engage them as to what's going to work for them. You know, can we create jobs that promote, agriculture, also promote health, and also promote even financial security. So thanks for having me.
I guess I'll go next. It's really great to be here. Quite an honor to be with you, Danny and Chloe, and guests. And in case there's any confusion, just want to share that Allie and I are not really, at least we don't know how we're related, if we are related, but it probably goes back several generations. So I came to be here as a result of, and also give a shout out to New Zealand sheep farmers there, Robyn. I started washing dishes in a restaurant when I was 14. When I was 16, I found myself as an exchange student in New Zealand, in outside of Queenstown, and living on a sheep farm, and actually three different sheep farms, and then proceeded to chef my way through my undergraduate career, majoring in community nutrition and international development. But always hacking on things like, I'll show my age here a little bit, the Commodore 64 computers. And my first out of the gate was, with my bachelor's degree, was to build a database system to track pesticide poisonings among farm workers for the state of California. And that was the first database of its kind. Proceeded to have a career in technology then, as opposed to having a career in food, mostly related to food and health, but eventually ending up in a corporate database position that I was not really entirely happy with, and decided to go back and get my doctorate in food science. And while I was there, and eventually a postdoc in physical medicine and rehabilitation, it just dawned on me that there really was a lack of coherency between the players across the supply chain as the food came out of the ground, as it's processed, as it's delivered, as it's consumed. Even nutritionists and biochemists talk about the same molecules with a different language. They count fatty acids, carbon molecules from different directions. And so there's not a coherence. in the way that we catalog knowledge and data about food as it moves through the food system. And so we started IC Foods, which is International Center for Food Ontology, Operability, Data, and Semantics. It's an acronym, and that's why it's in all caps. In an effort to begin to build standards for data and representation of that data in terms of ontologies, of computable vocabularies for sharing data back and forth. And last year, we spun that out into a standalone nonprofit. And now we're partnering with folks like Food Tank and GoDan, which is Global Open Data for Ag and Nutrition, and various others to begin to build these standardized ontologies and data models.
Thanks so much, Danny and Food Tank, for hosting this event. It's so nice to see you. It's so nice to meet all the rest of you, and very excited to participate in this conversation. I want to briefly just kind of go back to the origins of Refresh, because I think it helps answer the first question. So one of the most interesting things about working in the technology policy field, which is my background, is that people tend to discuss technology and the policies that are relevant to it as only applied to companies that you would think of as being technology companies. So companies like Google obviously would make the cut, or maybe thinking about your internet provider or your cell phone provider. But in reality, technology, AI, data analytics, all of this is used in every industry. And one of the things that really stood out to me was that there were a number of people based in DC or other sort of capital cities across the country who weren't quite making that connection in a real strong way. There was some idea around some of the data that's used in these fields, but we thought it might be useful to help illuminate and expand on what that connection looks like. And that was really the origin of the Refresh project. For me personally, the reason I was excited to be involved and I've had a fantastic time is really just about coming from families that farm. My home base is North Dakota. It's actually where I'm at today. And when you grow up in this kind of environment and then you go out into the world, you find that people do not understand much about farming. They have a lot of misperceptions. There's a lot of confusion around what farming looks like. I saw a great tweet that I wish I could remember who posted a couple weeks ago. That was basically the inside of a tractor from maybe the 1960s. It said, "This is what I think farming looks like." And then it had the inside of a cab of a sort of modern combine with all of the monitors that you would see and all of the data analytics you would be gathering. It's like, this is what farming really looks like, right? There's a ton of technology and information involved. And so the goal of this section of the platform for us when we were working on it was to help bridge the information that folks like the people at Google or in the technology policy space have around core data protection tenets that are all included in this policy, things like transparency, access, portability, control, data security. We really wanted to help connect those core concepts to the field of agriculture and food and help draw out for policymakers and others what those connections look like, some ways in which we think they could be beneficially improved in both senses and for both kind of sides of the Venn diagram. And so it's been a really incredible journey getting to know all of the experts who have participated in Refresh, just an absolutely astounding group of individuals, several, obviously this group included. And I am sort of humbled to be on the panel knowing relatively little about our food system, but I'm here to help if people have kind of ideas around how can we apply what we understand about technology policy around data protection as is typically understood in the context of like the technology industry to these sectors. What can we learn from that? How can we collaborate and better everyone's interests? So I'm very excited to be here today on this panel of experts. And thank you again, Danny and Food Tank, for bringing people together.
Thanks so much, Allie. This has been a really great couple of days and so excited to see you especially, but all of you. Again, Allie really helped create Refresh, and I'm so grateful for that. I think, you know, what I'd like to pick up on from what Ali said is this need for connections and breaking down silos. And that's why I was always so excited to be part of Refresh and work on the policy platform and the other kind of work that we're doing. And
one of the things that the platform brings out is that it suggests providing stakeholders with appropriate levels of access and control over the data they create, while also enabling the transparency that Robyn talked about before. And I'm wondering how you all think we can balance those needs. Like, those are very hard things to balance. And so maybe Robyn, I'll go to you first.
I think one of the tenets that's central to rePlant is that we put the farmer first. And if you think about our food and agricultural system, that has not happened. Our farmers carry $426 billion in debt. They have a negative on-farm income. You pick up the papers, there's stories about opioid epidemics and suicide epidemics. And now we have this legacy crisis where young people are looking at that and thinking economically, I don't want to go into this. We have not created the industry to be in any way appealing to the next generation. So that really is a food security crisis that we are staring down. And so to think about it, how do we actually build financial resiliency into this? And that's having the farmer at the heart of these conversations. And Allie's absolutely right. I mean, the myth of what farming looks like and what it did look like previously versus what it looks like today, I think it does an incredible disservice to our farmers when we do that, because they are managing these modern day operations with all kinds of computer technology and all kinds of data in a way that I don't think most people realize. And anytime I'm on a farm in North Dakota, which, we've been in conversations with AB InBev and their barley growers there, I just think, I wish I could pack up every member of Congress and bring them out here, because I think the policymakers have no idea what they're actually making policy about. So when I listen to conversations about this, my first thought is, I don't think the policy has a clue. I don't think our policymakers have a clue. And we've seen that same challenge in blockchain. When we sit down with companies like Nori, it's, well, what about the SEC? How are they actually regulating this? And we've seen that over and over in our government systems where the policymakers aren't up to speed enough to be able to help have these conversations. And so, again, I think it's, how do we bring these stakeholders together, all of these stakeholders, the capital partners, the food companies, the farmers, the data. And I love that you've assembled this group, because I couldn't pretend to know what Allie knows, but I do know the food and agricultural system. And I do think it's bringing together people from different industries. I know the greatest lessons I have learned have come from people outside of the industry and lessons they've learned in their industries, especially in tech, as it relates to food. So to host and have these conversations, to assemble organizations, bringing these people together. And again, I can't emphasize enough how important the transparency piece of it is, because, when we're talking about this data, even for example, with drone technology, if somebody is capturing that data off of that farm, who does it belong to? Does it belong to the people that have financed the farm? Does it belong to the farmer who's actually doing the work? Does it belong to the drone technology company, or does it belong to the people that have financed the drone company? And who does it belong to? And so I go back to a class I took in business school, which was actually on international law and the way that law is governed depending how far offshore you are. And I think, again, we have history lessons around us, but it's going to take this kind of consolidation of intellect and wisdom and expertise to really make sure that what we build is truly regenerative and we aren't actually building another model that's enormously extractive on the backs of our farmers.
Absolutely, Robyn. So you asked a lot of questions about who should own it. Who do you think should own this data?
At the heart of it, I think the farmer has, it's the farmer's work. It's his or her work. And so should there be some kind of partnership? When we introduced genetically engineered ingredients, there was a technology stewardship agreement that was introduced to farmers. Is there a technology stewardship agreement here? Can that just be taken from the farmer without his informed consent? I don't think that's right. So, is it some kind of contractual agreement where, there's a contractual agreement? You think about the agreement that we have when we share data with our doctors. I think about, that type of an agreement. There has to be some kind of agreement that's made. It can't just be taken and extracted.
Anyone else want to comment on this question around how you combine these two things, transparency and the need for control over data?
I'm sorry. Who are we talking?
Whoever wants to jump in, Matthew, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I just, I'm thinking about listening to Robyn and thinking about what she said. And in some ways, who owns the data? And you used a word, appropriate sharing, right? Well, who decides what's appropriate, right? And so that, I think the word appropriate isn't quite enough to get there. But often, if I'm building software and I want to hire a development team to build the software for me, well, who owns the code? It's the same kind of question, right? Do I own the code because I paid them to write something for me, or do they get to use the code for another customer? All that stuff needs to be spelled out, and I think we're not spelling things out clearly right now. Things are hidden in the fine print. And we don't have standard modeled sort of like if you go to rent an apartment, there's a standard lease agreement, right? And it's crafted, it's well known, so we need things like that, tools like that people can come along and say, okay, I understand. Maybe the code, for instance, is yours, but I can use it, or I can use summary statistics, or I can use anonymized summary statistics, or I can use, so what is that negotiation? What are the various parts? How can we parse that out so that people can have? I know that I went to my local grocery store because I live in California, and I tried to, we have the California personal data privacy law. And I said, okay, I want my shopping history. I paid for all that food. I bought it all. I have a receipt. I get receipts. I wanted my shopping history. According to my loyalty card. And they wrote back and said, no, that's not, some people share loyalty cards, so we're not going to give that to you. And I thought that was just crazy. So even as far as that's the other end of the food system, right? So who really owns that data?
Allie, I know you have some thoughts about this as well.
This is such a great train of thought. And I just had kind of a high level observation, which is all of these questions are fantastic questions. They're difficult questions, but they're not unanswerable questions. And one of the things about data protection, whether that's in the form of a law or norms or agreements, like some of the other tools folks have described, is that it actually facilitates the use of data. I think one of the misunderstandings about the idea of a privacy law, for example, like the one Matthew was just describing, is people panic and they think, well, this is going to restrict my use of data and I am worried about it. But in a lot of ways, when you have these rules and you have these norms, it actually enables and empowers you to use data because you have a better understanding of how to use it safely, of how to cooperate, of what the boundaries are that are acceptable. And it really empowers good actors to use data. And so this is one of the reasons why Google has supported a federal baseline privacy law. We've also put out a number of open source technologies that help with data management in privacy preserving ways. So one example is we have a data transfer project, which is an open source project that's a collaboration between us and a number of other people in the industry, including Apple, Twitter, Microsoft, and Facebook. And the idea there is to basically build on what I think, if I understood correctly, what Matt was describing in terms of common data models. So how can you help people understand that two data sets could be interoperable or could be combined? And if you're talking about something like photos, I mean, I think everyone on the call could sort of rattle off a number of file names for photos, right? Like JPEG, GIF. But if you're talking about irrigation data, I guess it could be a comma separated value, but I don't know if there are more formats of that data. And so one of the things that Data Transfer Project has been interested in doing is understanding better this kind of field of data and how we might help build data models to encourage the kind of sharing and shared use and mobility that could really promote that kind of use of data that we think is instrumental to the future of really everything, but including agriculture and food. One last point on this, I do think it's really interesting to hear everyone's views on questions of how to use all of this data in the most appropriate way. I would note that one of the kind of benefits of technology in the format exists today is you don't necessarily have to only have one entity that is using a data set. And so some of the other open source technologies that Google have put out are tools to help collaborate on data sets. And I can't remember if it was Robyn or Matt, but somebody mentioned the idea that there are aggregate statistics, there are analytics you can run over data to share safely insights from it. So it's a really rich field. There's a lot of things going on in the capital T technology industry that can help, I think, address some of the really interesting questions that are being asked here by the panelists.
Thank you guys so much. I'm so glad we're digging into all of this. Kacey, I want to bring you in here. The public health world has been using population and medical data, helping to formulate policy for a really long time. What can the food and agriculture world learn from public health in terms of data use to enact change, especially when it comes to making sure it's in an ethical manner?
Thanks for weaving me in. And I think that, Robyn, I think nailed it. I think when we think about our PHI, our private medical information, there are some really key things that we don't want shared. Okay. And so I think that's where our data, sharing agreements come in. We also have information that, as people are, collecting data for research, they also want to combine data from physicians' offices. And so there's multiple sources and multiple pieces of a person's health profile, if you will, that's really, really important for some people to have access to. And so so I think that I'm just going to, kind of piggyback on kind of what was already said. The sharing of data is really supposed to help those who are sharing it. And therefore, what you bring to the table, you see value in what you're providing. And so I just want to just kind of create that. We're all exploring this. Clearly some are a little more advanced than others, but the medical field also has a little ways to go as well, because we are now in a place where people are so transient that they can see multiple physicians, and their records don't talk. And everyone wants to use their own, EHR system, these medical records software systems, if you will. And so I just want to offer that this is a systemic problem. And I think at the end of the day, when it comes to publishing, we ask the same questions. Who owns the data? And can I use this for this? And my own entity in population health, we did establish a data core to address these exact issues. We've got multiple hospital systems here. The city has open records that they actually provide. There are people who are doing research, and there needed to be a neutral source that would say, we will establish those data agreements. You get to decide what comes in. You get to decide who uses your data, who publishes with it. So there does need to be that central hub, if you will, in each community or amongst different types of farming entities. But that's essentially how we're doing it. And I can say that it is a laborious process. But I think at the end of the day, if what's important is for that transparency to happen, then these are the conversations that must be had. And you've got to bring all of those different people, the technology to the table, the community to the table, because people don't want bad things shared too, right? We got to bring farmers to the table. And then ultimately researchers, people who can help people to decipher the data, look at trends. And then I think one thing that we're not really talking about is who's paying for it. So I just want to offer that up as well, because that's really the number one challenge, I think, in the public health world versus even the medical world. There is a payer in the medical world. We tend to work on grants in the public health world. And so that whole dynamic of who's funding the sharing and who's funding the collection of the data is also something that we dance with as well.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I'd love to stay along the lines of that thinking, especially yesterday with broadband. We were talking a lot about how potential solution is becoming a public utility. I know that's a topic that's broadly been used in terms of agribusiness, and it is a potential solution. So what do folks think here? Obviously, especially with broadband, the public markets haven't been able to give competitive pricing to a lot of rural areas. We've had a decade of failure. So where should this go from here? How could data protection learn from those mistakes?
Matthew, I'm going to call on you.
Well, that's a good question. I guess I would sort of want to drill into your question a little bit more. What mistakes do you see as being sort of not wanting to be replicated there, Chloe?
I personally see it as the public markets not being able to meet the needs of the rural areas and of farmers, especially when it comes to technology, in a way that I just honestly don't think we have enough time to keep trying for. So which is why I think there needs to be potentially, maybe a public utility type joint venture solution. I don't know. Maybe you guys are the experts. I'm just the one asking questions, but I'd love to hear more about how this could be. I mean, Kacey brought it up, so.
Right. Oh, goodness. I'd like to, can I come back to that for a second? Because there was something else that Kacey said that sort of triggered me, and talking about electronic health records. And I just, if you don't mind, I'd like to chase that down. And that's the fact that we have very, very little dietary and food information in the health record. And we can't even operate in the same way that we can't get signal out to rural areas. Physicians can't operate over food data in the electronic health record. Not only are there no places in the health record to actually put diet information, and most of it's written by hand, and you've got to decipher the script that's been written on a paper chart, and then you have to find a place to put it. It's usually in some free text notes field. And so we can't keep track of it in the same way that we can keep track of pharmaceutical regimens, and that's crazy. That's crazy because our exposure to food is our most intimate and prolonged exposure to the environment that we have through the course of our life. And if you think about genes by environment, well, guess what? It's food. And so, going back and looking at rural access, not just to broadband, but also to food. We've got food swamps. We've got food deserts in the places, food apartheid, where food is being grown and people don't have access to food, which is crazy in a lot of places. And so we need solutions to carry the signal, I think, which is a little bit different than the data itself, but to carry the signal that has the data packages inside of it. And so to sort of bring it back around with what you were asking, Chloe, yeah, I think we do need utilities to bring that to place. And we need businesses who aren't afraid to say, wow, there is a market here. I just need to figure out how to access this market, and do it in a way that I can remain in business, and solve a problem at the same time. And I think people are working on that. And I have high hopes in the next, few years that we'll start to see some more equity there. Both in terms of the delivery of the signal, the delivery of the data, and the delivery of the food. Yeah, sorry.
Can I jump in on this, Chloe? So it's discrimination. I mean, what we're talking about is racial discrimination, which is what has created food deserts and food apartheid. It is flat out discrimination. And then the same thing we're seeing is broadband discrimination by these corporate entities that do not think it's in their best interest financially to expand into these different regions and areas. And again, it shows a complete disconnect, because the fact that we think in some way it is possible to discriminate broadband against the people that are growing our food is insanity. So again, I think it gets back to governance. You got to look at the governance of these corporations, and do they have any food industry expertise on these broadband boards? Probably not. Is there equity and inclusivity and those that can speak to this kind of discrimination? No. And so, when we talk about food insecurity and nutritional insecurity, we are talking about racism in the food system. And that same discrimination is being seen by these broadband players. And, you got to call it what it is, and you've got to call it out and say, is it in the best interest of our country for our broadband companies to be discriminating against these rural areas? Because that's what they're doing. The word can't is not the right word to use here. They absolutely can. It has not been a priority, just as it's not been a priority to feed these communities of color in these lower income areas.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. It's racism, it's classism, it's a lot of inequality and accessibility going on. We have some great questions. Bernie, could we go back to Susan Daladan, who had a question first? Bernie's my co-founder doing all of the work on the back end. If you can't bring it up, I'll go with Ursula. Sorry to disrupt. Go ahead. So Ursula says, how will true interoperability work to be a benefit if the core is local or regional? Almost none of food production. Okay, I'm going to go with Susan. Thanks, Bernie. So I think this is an important question. How do you use data to account for things like generational return, whether than capital return? There are so many aspects to food and health systems that are qualitative rather than quantitative. And I think that's such a great question to ask. I'll start picking on someone. Ali, do you want to take this?
I am sorry to say that I think this is a little out of the scope of my expertise on this point, Danny, but I am very eager to hear our other panelists' answers.
No problem. Who would like to jump in?
Yeah, I'm happy to sort of take a stab. I think that it's true that there are things that are qualitative rather than quantitative. In fact, I often say that everyone has a right to not just affordable food and nutritious food, but delicious food. Everyone has a right to deliciousness. It should be delicious. Delicious is qualitative, but we can quantify who has delicious food. We can quantify things like that. So if we sort of back up, we can get metrics on things that are qualitative at their heart by looking at aggregations of those qualities. And so in terms of generational return, that's harder because that doesn't match up with what Robyn was saying earlier, which is the quarterly reports that companies have to produce to their stockholders and investors, and sort of it's something that we have to change our philosophy on if we want to be more sustainable, and investors need to be in there, I think, for a longer term than a quarter and a pump and dump kind of model.
And I'll just add that, thank you for that. I'll just add that this is a cultural issue as well. And so, one of the things that I think we have to be mindful of is just even how food is portrayed in our media, that we have to start telling our own stories in order to help people to understand the qualitative being much more palatable versus the quantitative. And so, yeah, we still have, quarterly reports that we have to give, but there are other channels in which we can tell our stories, to make that shift and create a culture of health that is not based on, the size of the melon, versus the taste of the melon, right? And so I just want to offer that there's so much more to that qualitative piece that really has to be, we've got to hear stories from farmers, we've got to be hearing from the people who value the food differently than what it looks like on the revenue side, right? So just want to offer that cultural piece as well, that's a shift that we're making right now, as we're having this conversation, to say that, we want for transparency to be in place. We need for data to be shared, but at the same time, the story about food and health and how it plays a role in every single human being's life is really, that's the story that's not being told. It needs to be.
I really love that you brought that up, Kacey. Thank you so much. If Chloe doesn't mind, I want to get one more viewer's question in from Yvette Grace. Bernie, could you bring that up? Yvette has been prolifically commenting, and I want to make sure her voice is heard. We'll just give Bernie 1 second while he does the back end. Thank you, Bernie. So how much of this data can become public information so that the passion for this industry can also become public. A student or startup one generation away from us here today should inherit data. So I wonder what folks' comments are on that. Robyn, you just nodded, so I'm going to call on you.
You know, I've had the privilege of working with this incredible team of scientists over the last several years, and they are doing a lot of follow-on work to Matthew, some of the work that you started in pesticides and human health. And I think what's fascinating is that rather than go at it through the United States Department of Agriculture, they're in communication with Health and Human Services. So again, it's really to think about these systems that we've inherited and really acknowledge, you know, what's working and what is not working. And are there better places to house this information and better places to have this conversation? So Health and Human Services should very much be part of this conversation, because when we are talking about soil health, we are talking about human health, and we are talking about planet health. I mean, there is nothing more powerful, and it's why so many eyes all of a sudden are on the food industry. Is we've all woken up to the fact that we are literally standing on a very powerful solution to so many of our challenges, both personally, you know, and at a global level. So, you know, again, it's really to step back and say, do these agencies represent the needs that we now have in the 21st century with the awareness that we now have in the 21st century? And I think one of the first places to start is, should the Food and Drug Administration be tidy under one roof? Or should we have a food agency? And should we have a drug agency? And should there be a data agency? I mean, really, we are at a point, you know, we see this tension, we see these hearings before Congress. Where is that agency? And how can we make sure that the people that are inside of that agency actually have the knowledge and expertise to actually begin to figure out the right policies around this? And I think, you know, again, we just kind of roll administration to administration. We roll and we roll and we roll, and we don't change anything. And here in the state of Colorado, we are extremely fortunate to have an absolutely brilliant agricultural secretary. And she is actually before the state legislature right now, trying to create a new position, which is agricultural resource officer. And it's recognizing that there is a stewardship of the soil here that serves a much greater role than just the food that's coming off of that land, that there is this, you know, incredible role in climate. So that's the invitation, is to, like, let's bring some creativity into this. Let's bring some innovation into this. And let's say, hey, yeah, we've inherited, you know, we're great with innovation and disruption. I mean, everyone on this panel has been part of that. And yet we get really stale when it comes to our government, and it just stays as this very entrenched institution. And what are ways that we can really think differently? And now that we are in the 21st century with technology involved in absolutely every aspect of our life, think about roles and agencies and responsibilities there too.
The other element I would point to is, I couldn't agree more with what Robyn has said. And I think there's another element, which is we don't always have to think of the way to increase data access as a new idea. Like, the USDA does hold a lot of data. There is a lot of data that is publicly available, but a lot of it is in PDF. So I think there's a modernization question as well about the data we already have. How can you make that available in a machine readable format? How can you make that scalable for people in the government and for people who need that data and want to access it? I saw another question come across about information that's basically behind university system paywalls. So helping people figure out, how can you make this data available more broadly in a safe way? Again, back to the province of sort of data protection, right? You don't want to put the less risk you create, the more comfortable people will be. But a lot of it is really just modernization of what is already available. And it's a really daunting process, especially when you do have a lot of information, but it's something that we really need to invest in as a country. It's definitely a worthwhile investment.
I'd just like to add to both of those items that Ali and Robyn were just talking about. You know, a lot of what we're talking about with small farmers, with accessing data that's behind university paywalls, with indigenous groups, these are all existential threats to the highly centralized food system that we have. The racism, the food apartheid that we've talked about, all of these things, all of these lifting up the little people, that they can do things on their own, and they don't need to rely on centralized systems from large centralized, whether it's farming or tech or any of them. They're an existential threat. And developing systems that support that existential threat from a government point of view, well, I mean, pick your political party that supports those things. So what it comes down to is, do we want to have, Ali made a great point that the data is not necessarily accessible. Data shouldn't be in PDFs. I would argue that that's information, not data. And data is something that is machine readable, and information is something that we can get when we read it. But we do need tools for everybody to be able to access these things, and easily. You shouldn't have to have a PhD to have to go and access these things, or have been a coder for 10 years or something like that. And I think that should be one of the primary missions of USDA at this point.
Great comments, everyone. And I like how we're bringing, so many different government agencies into this conversation. I think when I was thinking about the policy platform, I was thinking very narrowly about, how do we get this to congressional lawmakers? And there's a whole vast array of people who need to be reading this platform and learning from it. Chloe, I want to give you a chance to ask some more great questions.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think we've been getting at so much of this, but we haven't really actually officially talked about the inherent issue of trust here yet. Kacey talked about it earlier with the concept of needing a neutral body. Robyn just touched on it a little bit recently too with the third agency. There's so much happening, and the protection just really adds another layer to it all. I mean, I know from just my conversations with farmers, there's so much skepticism with getting, things like sensors put on their fields, because there's just so much different ag tech funding and different startups happening right now in different ways that technology is being thrown at folks at once. So could we talk about the trust, the role that trust plays here, and how, that will really impact data protection policy in the future? Ali?
Yeah, I mean, trust is absolutely essential. I'm actually very eager to hear from the other panelists on this. I think their contributions in this context will be more valuable. But one thing I would note, and forgive me for repeating myself, is really just that these baseline standards, these common ideas, applying what we know from data protection to this field does help increase trust, right? Having these understandings and these rules about access and portability, control, deletion, these types of things are all really essential and components of a trusted system. And partly because you know what to expect. I think there's a lot of just confusion and uncertainty right now that does create a lack of trust just inherently. But I think that you're right that there's also an inherent skepticism about the role of technology on a farm. Danny and I had a great experience when we were hosting an event in Chicago for Refresh, and I was on the panel with our colleague Don, who's a farmer in New Mexico, and we were sort of bantering back and forth about technology, and he's very old school, and we ended up talking about his phone. And I was like, your phone is also technology, which is just like a very, very baseline kind of piece of information. We tend to think of things as not being technology anymore once we're used to them. And we tend to think of artificial intelligence, for example, the bar sort of keeps moving on what is AI. And as we get used to AI in our lives, we no longer think of it as something that's scary or risky. We don't think of it at all. And so that's one of the things that we have to observe about trust, is that we tend to focus on where there isn't trust. But actually, if you look back in the long arc of the development and integration of technology in a digital sense into farming, you do see trust being developed over time when technologies prove themselves to be useful, when they prove themselves to be reliable, and when you can trust and understand what the conditions are of using that technology. And that's what data protection helps create, is that last piece. It helps you understand what are the conditions. You have sort of an agreement around the rules of these core tenets. And that's where I would see data protection being able to increase trust and to maybe accelerate that process of sort of embedding technology, digital technology, into agriculture and food systems.
And I'll just add a little bit of just our community engagement, techniques that we have. It's really important that, like shareholders, have conversations with each other. And I think that there is trust amongst, like entities. And I think that in order to facilitate those conversations, it's really, really important to be asking questions like, who's using what? Where are you getting it from? How did you establish this relationship? How has it benefited, your business? And those are questions that it would be much better to hear the answers from someone who's like you versus someone who's trying to sell it to you. And so I think that that's just a technique that we have to use. And then the last thing that I'll say too is that we have to build it. I think Allie is dead on in saying that, there is trust that's already there, but we tend to focus on where there's lack of trust or mistrust, or just flat out, deceit, right? And I think that moving forward, there just has to be this constant building of trust, so that people understand that this is a relationship. It's two-way, and just like I can get into something, I can potentially pull out of it. And I think that's what we even have to do when we do research, right? We have a consent form. We have to explain everything that we're planning to do, and whether or not we're going to give you back the information and how. And these are techniques that, again, we are building trust as we go along the way. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I'd like to add that this kind of circles back to the beginning of our conversation, that spelling things out in contract really is what enables trust. If you know that you're legally bound or obligated, then you're going to be more trustful of the person you're engaging with, like the model lease thing that I mentioned before. You can trust your landlord more if you know that it's not just some contract that they drew up that you're going to sign, in a rush, but it's something that's, been vetted by attorneys for the community or something like that. The other aspect of trust, I think, is the emergence of new technologies. And I mean, if we look at social media, for instance, or a variety of the technology that we've gotten used to, like Allie said, we don't consider phones tech anymore, but they're collecting all kinds of data about us, right? Who owns that? Well, turns out, I guess we do, kind of, not really. So again, in educating people about their data and what that means and how valuable it is, that becomes an existential threat to the people who are making money and products from that data. And so it's not just a matter of trust and contracts. It's a matter of, are we going to have an educated population who understands the true worth of that data? And that's where I think the conversation we need to have. Do you want to keep people in the dark?
I would just add to this, we're talking about the farmer. So the farmer's the end user here. We're all the end user of the computer, we're the end user of the phone. The user that we need to engage here is the farmer. And I've met with so many brilliant entrepreneurs, PhDs, founders of these ag tech companies who actually have never actually run their concept by a farmer. They don't have any kind of advisory committee of farmers. And can you imagine trying to bring a product to market without testing it against the actual end user? And I think we forget that. And I think, again, it's this cultural framing that we have in the United States of farmers somehow being less than. These guys are central to all of this working. And so when we meet with ag tech companies, is how have you engaged the farmer in this conversation? Have you actually tested this technology on farm? And then, for us, we've recognized they don't want to hear from us. They actually don't want to hear from anybody on this panel. They will listen farmer to farmer. And so in a place like North Dakota, as regenerative agriculture is starting to take hold, it's a farmer connecting to another farmer that's talking about, these are the steps that I took, and I saved $500,000 in the first year in the conversion of 7,000 acres. That is the synergy, and that is the connectivity. And so it's trust within the relationships within the community. And I think that too often is forgotten. And so, the first question I ask of any ag tech entrepreneur is, have you actually tested this on farm? And what is the relationship that you have with the farm community?
Yeah, I think the other piece of what Robyn is saying that's so smart, all of it is very smart, and I really appreciated Kacey's comments as well about value. But I think what I think has been really an important lesson for me in the refresh process is the time it took for me as someone coming in from Google to earn the trust of the people who we were meeting with. I don't remember, Danny, if you were at the first meeting in St. Louis, but it was definitely a process. Like, it was definitely a journey of, proving our value, proving our contributions, listening, learning. All those things this is just basic human stuff, but I think we do tend to think that there's something different that needs to be applied once the word technology is in the room. And really, a lot of the stuff that we know, community engagement, Kacey's excellent points on community engagement, a lot of this is just foundational stuff that we need to apply to this field. We don't need to reinvent everything. Just because we're using the word artificial intelligence doesn't mean we have to try to change everything up. So I think that's a really important component of this, and I'm really I'm grateful to Food Tank for continuing this work. Events like this also do help with that type of trust building exercise. And I'm grateful for the folks in Refresh who did give me a chance. And we've had a great partnership since then. But I think a lot of that has really been based on thinking about what is it about technology that gives us anxiety? Is there something we can do to overcome that as communities? Is there things we can share to each other, learn from each other? So the trust you have in the people around you, as both Kacey and Robyn are saying, is really what is the foundation for the trust in the tools, right? It can't just be the tool, it has to be each other. And I think Refresh has done a really amazing job of demonstrating that and making it real, at least for this sort of subset of the Venn diagram.
Wow, what a great way to end, Ali. It's really all about relationships. We've been talking all week about how farmers need to be part of these conversations from the very beginning, that all of this work needs to be participatory, that relationships and communication are all key. I want to thank Chloe for being such a great co-moderator. I want to thank all of our amazing panelists, all of our viewers. We had incredible questions today, so insightful and incredible comments. I want to remind you that this discussion will be available on our podcast, Food Talk with Danny Nierenberg. And please join us back here tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Time when we'll be talking about a digitally skilled workforce. Thank you all again. Please stay safe and well, wear your masks, do all that. And thank you again.